There is a suburb in Melbourne, Australia that has a secret. It has had this secret for nearly 60 years. The secret lives in the memories of people who are now elderly, people who were children when it happened, teenagers standing in a schoolyard on an ordinary Wednesday morning in April, watching something that should not have been there descend from a pale autumn sky and settle quietly into the long grass of a paddock at the edge of their school grounds. 220 witnesses, students, teachers, staff, people who had no reason to lie, no reason to fabricate, no reason to spend the next 6 decades of their lives insisting that what they saw was real. People who were warned, some of them in the most explicit terms, by men in uniforms and men in suits, to say nothing, to tell no one, to go home and forget. They could not forget. The Westall UFO incident of 1966 is not well known outside Australia. Within Australia, it is known primarily to those who lived through it, or those who have spent years trying to piece together what actually happened on the morning of April 6th in the southern suburbs of Melbourne, when something landed in a field called the Grange beside Westall High School and Westall State School, and when the Australian government, in the days and weeks that followed, worked very hard to make sure it stayed unknown. This is a story about that morning. It is a story told slowly, because the people who experienced it deserve that. It is a story told in detail because the details matter. It is told in the voices of those who were there, as best those voices can be reconstructed from decades of interviews, documentary footage, and personal accounts. And it is a story that, even now, does not have a clean ending, because the truth of what happened that morning has never been officially acknowledged, and the people who could have provided that acknowledgement chose silence instead. Settle in. This one takes time to tell properly. To understand the Westall incident, you first have to understand what Westall was in 1966. Not what it is now, which is a fairly ordinary suburb of Greater Melbourne, absorbed into the continuous urban sprawl that stretches in every direction from the city centre. What it was then. What it felt like to grow up there. Westall in 1966 was a working-class suburb on the southeastern edge of Melbourne's developed area. The kind of place where factories sat alongside housing commission homes, where fathers worked shifts and mothers kept gardens, where children walked to school through streets lined with modest brick houses with neat front lawns, where the land at the edges of the suburb still had some of the character of the paddocks and scrubland it had recently been converted from. The suburb took its name from Westall Road, which ran through it. The schools that feature in this story, Westall High School and Westall State School, sat next to each other on that road, separated by a fence, sharing in the particular atmosphere of post-war Australian public education. Classrooms with large windows, schoolyards of packed dirt and patchy grass, the smell of chalk dust and floor wax. Teachers who expected order and respect, and who got it, mostly, from the children of families who had come through the Depression and the war, and who understood that education was something to take seriously. The students who attended these schools in 1966 were predominantly the children of working-class families. Some had parents who had come from Britain during the assisted migration programs of the post-war era. Some had parents who had been born in Australia, 3rd or 4th generation. A few had parents from continental Europe, part of the post-war wave that was slowly diversifying the extraordinarily homogeneous Australian population of the time. These were not wealthy children. They were not children from families with connections or influence. They were ordinary kids in an ordinary suburb, going to ordinary schools. And on the morning of April 6th, they witnessed something extraordinary. The morning itself began in the way that autumn mornings in Melbourne frequently begin, cool and pale, the sky carrying that particular quality of southern hemisphere autumn light that is softer and more diffuse than the sharp brightness of summer. The temperature would have been in the mid to low teens, cool enough for a school jumper, not cold enough for a heavy coat. It was a Wednesday. School was in session. The time was approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. Some sources say 10:45, some say 11:15. The precise time has been a matter of some dispute in the 58 years since it happened, and the disagreements over timing are actually one of the more telling details in this story, for reasons we will come to later. But somewhere in that window of late morning, between the end of morning classes and before the lunch break, the ordinary Wednesday at Westall began to become something else. The first people to notice it were students who were outside. It was a school day and most students were in class, but there were always students outside during breaks and between classes, making their way across the schoolyard, heading to the toilets, doing the various things that students do in the spaces between formal instruction. The object appeared in the sky to the northwest of the school, coming from that direction, moving at a speed that was not consistent with the aircraft of the time. It was not fast in the way that military jets were fast. It was moving at a kind of deliberate, controlled pace that several witnesses would later describe as purposeful, as though whatever it was, it knew where it was going. The first descriptions of the object collected from witnesses over the years are remarkably consistent given the number of people who saw it and the time that has passed. It was silver or gray. It was disc-shaped or described as saucer-shaped, though some witnesses used the word cup. An upturned cup placed saucer to saucer, a shape that suggests a classic convex disc form with a pronounced central dome or hole. It had no wings. It made no sound that the first witnesses could hear, or if it made a sound, it was very faint, a low hum at most. One of the students who first saw it was a girl named Joy Clark, who was approximately 15 years old at the time and attending Westall High School. In interviews given decades later, Joy Clark described looking up from something she was doing in the schoolyard and seeing the object moving through the sky. Her first thought, she has said, was that it was a plane. But it did not look right for a plane. It was the wrong shape, the wrong color, and it was moving in a way that no plane she had ever seen moved. It was steady, controlled, almost gentle. She pointed it out to other students nearby. This is the thing about a sighting that happens in a schoolyard in broad daylight. You cannot keep it to yourself for long. One person looks up. They say something to the person next to them. That person looks up and says something to the person next to them. Within seconds, within a minute at most, the chain of attention that begins with one person saying, "Look at that," has spread to a dozen people, then 24, then a crowd standing in the schoolyard with their faces tilted to the sky. The object continued its approach toward the school, descending as it came. And then, in full view of the growing number of students who had gathered to watch, it disappeared behind a stand of trees at the far edge of the school grounds, in the direction of the open paddock known as the Grange. The Grange was a piece of open agricultural land adjacent to the school. In 1966, it was used for grazing. It was separated from the school grounds by a line of pine trees that formed a windbreak along one edge of the property. It was not part of the school. Children were not supposed to go there. And it was precisely where the object appeared to be headed. Students began moving toward the trees, not in a panicked rush, more in the way that a crowd of curious young people moves toward something unusual and interesting. A quick walk, a jog, the press of bodies all oriented in the same direction, drawn by the irresistible pull of something that should not be there, but apparently is. They broke through the line of trees and came out into the Grange. And there it was. Section 3. What they saw in the Grange. The descriptions of what the students found in the Grange when they came through the trees are among the most vivid and consistent elements of the entire Westall incident. For something that happened nearly 60 years ago, the core details have held up with remarkable stability across multiple witnesses speaking independently over many decades. This consistency is one of the things that makes the Westall incident so difficult to dismiss. The object had landed. Or, if it had not landed in the sense of resting entirely on the ground, it was at least extremely close to the ground, hovering just above the surface of the paddock, or touching it so gently that the distinction was almost academic. It was in the Grange. It was real. It was close enough to see clearly. The students who came through the trees found themselves standing at varying distances from the object, some as close as 20 or 30 meters, others holding back at greater distances. Those who came closest have given the most detailed descriptions. Those at greater distances confirmed the general shape and appearance without being able to add the finer details. The object was silver gray, with a surface that appeared smooth and metallic. It was disc-shaped, wider than it was tall, with a pronounced raised section in the upper center that several witnesses described as a dome or a cupola. The edges of the disc were clean and regular, not ragged or irregular the way that some atmospheric phenomena can appear. This was a manufactured thing. It had the quality of something made, of something engineered, of something that had come from a workshop or a factory or a place where things were designed and built with precision. It was perhaps the size of 2 or 3 cars placed end to end. The estimates of size vary somewhat between witnesses, which is to be expected given that people are generally poor at estimating the size of unfamiliar objects at uncertain distances. But the broad consensus is something roughly 5 to 10 meters in diameter, with a height proportional to a disk of that width. Not enormous, not tiny. Present and real in the paddock in a way that made everything around it seem suddenly, weirdly normal by comparison. There was, several witnesses reported, a quality to the air around the object that was hard to describe. Some said there was a slight shimmer, like heat haze, though the morning was cool. Some said there was a faint smell, like ozone or something burning but not burning, an electrical quality to the air that made the hairs on their arms stand up. Some said there was a humming sound, very low, almost below the threshold of hearing, more felt in the chest than heard with the ears. One of the students who was among the first to reach the object in the Grange was a girl who would later be interviewed extensively about what she saw. She described running across the paddock toward the object, getting to within perhaps 20 meters of it, and then, she used the word suddenly, feeling an intense sensation of heat and a pressure that she could not explain, and the object simply rose. It rose vertically, without any of the preliminary noise or preparation that accompanies the takeoff of any aircraft she had ever seen or heard about. One moment it was there, close enough to touch if she had taken a few more steps. The next moment it was moving upward, climbing with a speed that seemed impossible for something of its apparent mass. And within seconds, it was gone into the sky. She fell over when it left. Other witnesses confirmed this, that several students were knocked down or stumbled when the object departed, as though there was a physical force associated with its departure that was strong enough to disturb the physical equilibrium of people standing nearby. This detail, the students being knocked over or stumbling when the object left, is one of the elements that most compellingly argues against any conventional explanation for what was seen that morning. It implies a physical force. It implies that whatever was in that paddock was not an optical illusion, not a misidentified weather balloon or light phenomenon or atmospheric anomaly. It was something with mass, something with physical properties that extended outward from the object itself, something that interacted with the physical world in a direct and tangible way. And then it was gone. But the morning was far from over. Section 4. The crowd in the schoolyard. While some students had run through the trees into the Grange and seen the object at close range, the majority of the witness population at Westall that morning had remained in the schoolyard. And from the schoolyard, looking over or through the line of pine trees at the boundary of the school property, they had watched. They had watched the object descend behind the trees. They had watched, in the minutes that followed, as a crowd of their fellow students gathered near and then beyond those trees. And then they had watched something extraordinary. Multiple aircraft appeared in the sky over the Grange. This is a detail that tends to get somewhat lost in the broader telling of the Westall story because it is, in some ways, more immediately explicable than the appearance of the UFO itself. Aircraft, after all, are normal. Aircraft exist. But the timing of their appearance and their behavior during the incident is a detail that the witnesses have consistently flagged as strange and significant. 5 aircraft appeared. Some witnesses say 5, some say more. The consensus is somewhere between 5 and 8. They were small aircraft, light aircraft of the kind that might be operated by a flying school or by private pilots or by the military for light reconnaissance purposes. They circled the area. They circled specifically the Grange, the paddock where the disc had been, going around and around it in a pattern that suggested to the watching students that they were looking for something, monitoring something, tracking something. These aircraft did not land. They did not broadcast anything over speakers. They did not deploy any personnel. They simply circled. And they continued circling for some time after the disc had already departed, which created the strange spectacle of conventional aircraft orbiting a paddock in which something had just been, as though trying to confirm or document what had taken place there. This is significant for several reasons. The appearance of multiple aircraft almost immediately after a UFO sighting in a remote location suggests the possibility of a monitored or pre-existing awareness of the object's presence or flight path. If the Grange was completely unknown and the object's arrival was completely unexpected, one would not expect to find multiple aircraft over it within minutes of the object's departure. The speed of their appearance raises questions about foreknowledge, about whether someone somewhere had been tracking this object and dispatched these aircraft when it began to descend. Or, alternatively, these aircraft were already in the area for entirely unrelated reasons, and their presence over the Grange was coincidental. A coincidence that the watching students quite naturally interpreted as connected to what they had just seen. This is possible. It is the kind of mundane explanation that looks very compelling from a distance, and somewhat less compelling when you sit down with the witnesses and listen to their accounts in detail. Back in the schoolyard, the mood among the students was, by all accounts, one of stunned excitement. 200 and more young people had just witnessed something they could not categorize, something that did not fit any familiar framework of understanding. They had seen an object that was not a plane. They had seen it descend and land. Some of them had seen it up close. Some had been knocked down when it left. All of them had seen the aircraft circling afterward. They were talking, the way that large groups of excited young people talk. Loudly, rapidly. In clusters and pairs, the story already beginning to circulate and be compared and be confirmed across the population of witnesses. Did you see it? Yes, I saw it. What was it? I don't know. Did you see how it just went straight up? Yes. Did you feel that? Yes. This is the moment at which the official response to the Westall incident begins. Section 5. The Teachers. The teachers at Westall High School and Westall State School were, in 1966, people of a particular type. They were products of an educational culture that valued authority and order and the smooth running of institutional life. They were not, as a rule, people who encouraged their students to dwell on anomalous experiences or to question official accounts of things. They were working in an era when the relationship between educational institutions and the broader apparatus of government authority was considerably more seamlessly integrated than it perhaps is today. When the excitement in the schoolyard became too great to ignore, the teachers came out. And what they found was 200 students, or something close to that number, all talking about the same thing, all in various states of excitement or disturbance, all describing an object that had descended behind the tree line at the boundary of the school grounds. The teacher whose response to the incident has been most documented over the years was a science teacher at Westall High School named Andrew Greenwood. Andrew Greenwood is a significant figure in the Westall story because he was an adult professional witness, a man with a science education who had seen the object independently, who took what he saw seriously, and who in the years that followed was one of the more willing witnesses to speak about what had happened. Greenwood saw the object from the schoolyard. He described it as a silvery green disc shape. His description matches in its essential features the descriptions given by students. He saw it descend behind the trees. He was aware of the aircraft circling in the sky over the Grange, and he was aware that whatever had just happened was not something that the school's institutional processes had any procedure for dealing with. The initial response of the teaching staff was, in the circumstances, somewhat predictable. Students were corralled. The excitement was dampened, or an attempt was made to dampen it. There was talk of getting back to class, of the school day continuing, of the normal order of things reasserting itself over the disruption. Some teachers, according to later accounts, told students that they had not seen what they thought they had seen, that there must be an ordinary explanation, that they should calm down and stop talking about it. This response, the attempt to normalize and minimize, is one of the things that has contributed to the sense, among many who study the Westall case, that something significant happened and that significant efforts were made to contain it. A completely ordinary event does not require teachers to tell students that they did not see what they saw. A weather balloon or a light aircraft or a piece of atmospheric debris does not require the kind of institutional management that appears to have been applied to the Westall incident in the hours and days following April 6th. But before the full machinery of official response could be deployed, there was one more piece of the morning's extraordinary sequence of events to unfold. The principal called an assembly. Section 6. The Assembly and the Warning. The assembly that the principal of Westall High School called in the aftermath of the morning's events was, by the accounts of those who were present for it, one of the most unusual experiences of their school lives. Not because of anything dramatic that was said, but because of the particular quality of what was said, and the atmosphere in which it was said. Students were called to gather. They assembled in the way that students assembled in 1966, orderly, in lines, on the asphalt of the school ground or in the school hall, depending on which account you were following. The principal addressed them. The substance of what the principal said, as reconstructed from the memories of witnesses who have given accounts over the years, was approximately this. They should not talk about what they had seen that morning. They should not discuss it with each other. They should not tell their parents. What they thought they had seen had a normal explanation, and the appropriate authorities would look into it, and in the meantime, the best thing they could do was to return to their regular school activities and say nothing further on the subject. The students were, by all accounts, perplexed by this, not because they found the instruction impossible to follow. Children in 1966 were considerably more conditioned to follow institutional authority than their counterparts might be today, but because the instruction was so clearly strange. You do not hold an assembly and instruct 200 students to keep silent about something unless that something is real and significant and you have been told or have decided that it needs to be contained. If what had happened that morning were simply a weather balloon or a light aircraft or a cloud formation or any other ordinary thing, the appropriate institutional response would not be a formal assembly and a directive to stay quiet. The appropriate institutional response would be a brief explanation of what had actually been seen, and then a return to normal activities. The very fact that the response was a silence directive rather than an explanatory debriefing is, itself, evidence that the people in charge of the school had no ordinary explanation to offer. Several students who were present at that assembly have spoken about it over the years with a particular vividness, because it was memorable, because it was strange, because it was the moment at which the experience of witnessing the object in the Grange ceased to be simply an unusual and exciting thing, and became something with a quality of official suppression around it that made it more troubling, not less. One witness, speaking in a documentary filmed decades later, described the assembly in terms that have stayed with researchers who study this case. She said the principal appeared frightened. That is the word she used. Not stern, not authoritative in the ordinary way of school principals. Frightened, as though he had himself received instruction from someone, or a communication from some authority above him, and the communication had made him afraid. Whether or not that interpretation is accurate, whether the principal's demeanor at that assembly was truly one of fear, or whether it was simply the particular gravity that the situation seemed to call for, the directive itself remained constant in the memories of those who heard it. Be quiet. Say nothing. This is not to be discussed. And then, within hours, the men arrived. Section 7. The men in suits and uniforms. The arrival of men in suits and military uniforms at Westall High School on the afternoon of April 6th and in the days that immediately followed is among the most consistently reported elements of the Westall incident. It is the element that most clearly suggests that whatever happened that morning had come to the attention of some official body, governmental or military, and that this official body had decided that active management of the witness population was necessary. The men came to the school. Multiple witnesses have described this. They came to the school and they spoke to staff and to some students. The precise nature of these conversations varied by account. Some witnesses describe being called individually into a room and spoken to by a man or men who asked them to describe what they had seen and then told them, in terms that ranged from polite to pointed, that they were to say nothing more about it. Others describe overhearing conversations between adults, between teachers and men they did not recognize, in which the language was clearly about the morning's events, and the subject of those events was clearly being treated as something sensitive. One teacher, not Andrew Greenwood but another staff member, was reportedly told in very direct terms to cease discussion of the incident and to ensure that students in their care did the same. This teacher's subsequent behavior, according to colleagues and students, changed noticeably after whatever conversation they had with the men who came to the school. They became unwilling to discuss the morning's events. They became visibly uncomfortable when students raised the subject. Whether that discomfort came from genuine alarm or from an instruction to maintain silence that they intended to follow, or from some combination of the two, cannot now be determined. But the change in their demeanor was observed and remembered. Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher, was among those spoken to. His account of what was said to him in those conversations is one of the more detailed that exists from a teacher witness at Westall. He described being told that what he had seen could be explained, that there was an explanation, but that the explanation was classified and he was not in a position to know what it was. He was told that the appropriate course of action was silence. He was told that discussing the incident could cause unnecessary public alarm. The phrase unnecessary public alarm appears in several of the accounts from this period. It is an interesting phrase. It presupposes that any alarm that would result from public discussion of the incident would be unnecessary, which is to say, unjustified, which is to say that the true nature of what was seen was either not alarming or not what the witnesses thought it was. But if the true nature of what was seen were simply a weather balloon or a light aircraft or something equally mundane, there would be no public alarm to prevent. You do not speak of preventing unnecessary public alarm in connection with a weather balloon. The men in suits and uniforms stayed at or near the school for some time. The exact duration varies by account. Some say a day, some say they appeared repeatedly over the following week. The question of who they were, whether they were military, civilian government, intelligence service, or some combination, has never been definitively answered. No organization has ever officially acknowledged sending representatives to Westall High School in April 1966 in connection with the incident of that morning. Section 8. The Physical Evidence. When the students who had pushed through the trees into the Grange returned to the schoolyard, and when, in the subsequent hours, adults were able to examine the paddock more closely, what they found there was physical evidence of something having been present in the grass. The grass in the Grange was flattened in a circular pattern, not a rough, irregular pattern of the kind that might be created by wind or by an animal lying down. A clean, defined, roughly circular area of depressed and flattened vegetation. The kind of pattern that would be consistent with a circular object having rested or hovered very close to the surface of the ground for some period of time. The size of the flattened circle was described by various witnesses as roughly 3 to 4 meters in diameter. Some describe it as larger. The grass was not simply bent. In some accounts, it was described as scorched or discolored, as though heat had been applied. The soil in the center of the circle was, according to some witnesses, harder than the surrounding ground, compacted in a way that was not consistent with simply having grass pressed onto it. This physical evidence did not survive long. Sometime in the days following the incident, the area of the Grange where the physical evidence was present was cleared. Not in the ordinary course of agricultural maintenance. Witnesses who returned to look at the evidence in the days after April 6th found it gone. The grass was cut or removed. The circle was no longer visible. What had been a clearly defined physical anomaly in the paddock had been rendered indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. The speed of this erasure, and the apparent deliberateness of it, is another of the elements in the Westall story that suggests active intervention. An agricultural paddock does not typically receive special attention to its ground-level features within days of a UFO report, unless someone has decided that those features need to be removed from the record. The clearing of the physical evidence at the Grange is consistent with the broader pattern of what happened at Westall in the days following April 6th. The assembly with its silence directive, the men in suits visiting the school, the discouragement of teachers from discussing the incident, all of it pointing in the same direction. There is an additional piece of physical evidence that is less frequently discussed, but which appears in several accounts. One of the students who was among those closest to the object when it was on the ground at the Grange later received medical attention for burns or skin irritation that she attributed to her proximity to the object when it departed. The nature and extent of these injuries, and whether they were definitively connected to the incident, are not fully documented in any public record. But the reports of physical symptoms in students who were closest to the object are another element of the Westall story that points toward the physical reality of what was witnessed. Section 9. The 9 Witnesses. Now we come to the heart of this story. Not the theories, not the official responses, the people. The 200 and more individuals who were present in the schoolyard and the Grange on the morning of April 6, 1966, and who carried what they saw in their memories for the rest of their lives. Over the decades, a number of these witnesses have given detailed accounts of their experiences. 9 of them have been particularly significant in building the public record of what happened at Westall. Here are their stories, told with the detail and the care that they deserve. Witness 1. Andrew Greenwood. Andrew Greenwood was not a student. He was a science teacher at Westall High School, a man with a professional background in scientific observation and a trained habit of careful description. This makes his testimony particularly valuable in the record of the Westall incident, not because the testimony of young people is less reliable. There is no evidence that the student witnesses were less accurate than adult witnesses, but because his professional context gives his account a particular kind of weight in a culture that tends to discount the observations of children. Greenwood saw the object from the schoolyard. He was outside, as teachers sometimes were during periods when students were between classes, and he looked up to see the object in the sky. His description of what he saw is one of the most detailed adult accounts of the Westall object. He described it as silvery green in color, a disc shape, moving in a way that was inconsistent with any conventional aircraft. He watched it descend behind the line of trees at the boundary of the school property. He was also one of those who observed the conventional aircraft, the light planes, that appeared over the Grange in the aftermath of the object's arrival and departure. He found their presence as strange as the students did, and he has said in interviews that their rapid appearance over the area struck him as evidence that the object's arrival in the area had been known about or tracked by someone before it appeared over the school. In the years following the incident, Greenwood was one of the most willing of the Westall staff to speak about what had happened. He gave interviews to researchers and to documentary filmmakers. He was consistent in his account across multiple decades of retelling, which is one of the hallmarks of genuine witness memory as opposed to reconstructed or confabulated memory. And he was consistently frustrated by the official silence that surrounded the incident. He died before the most recent wave of attention to the Westall case, and his testimony now exists primarily in recorded interviews and in the accounts of researchers who spoke to him personally. But his contribution to the documented record of the incident is substantial, and his willingness to speak has helped preserve a body of first-hand adult witness testimony that would otherwise have been lost. Witness 2. Joy Clark. Joy Clark was approximately 15 years old in April 1966, a student at Westall High School, and one of the first students to see the object from the schoolyard. Her account of what she saw in those first moments, looking up, processing the shape and the motion of the object, registering that it was not an aircraft, pointing it out to others, is among the clearest early sighting accounts in the Westall record. Clark was not among those who ran into the Grange. She remained in the schoolyard and watched from there, which means her account is focused on the aerial phase of the incident rather than the landing and ground phase. What she saw from the schoolyard was consistent with what others were seeing: the disc shape, the silver-gray coloring, the deliberate, controlled descent, the object disappearing behind the tree line. What she has consistently added, in interviews given over many decades, is the quality of her certainty. She has never wavered in her account. She has never suggested that what she saw might have been something ordinary that she misidentified. She saw something real, something that was not a plane or a balloon or a cloud or anything else in her existing framework for understanding objects in the sky. And that certainty, maintained consistently across nearly 60 years, is part of what makes the Westall witness population so compelling as a body of evidence. Clark was also one of those instructed to stay quiet. She remembers the assembly. She remembers the directive from the principal. She remembers the period of days following the incident, during which the ordinary social process of talking about unusual things was subject to an unusual suppression. And she has spoken about all of this with a clarity that reflects the lasting impact of the event on her life. Witness 3. Jacqueline Argent. Jacqueline Argent was one of the students who ran into the Grange. Her account is among the most physically immediate of all the witness accounts in the Westall record, because she was among those who got close enough to the object to see it clearly before it departed. Her description of the object at ground level is consistent with the other close-range accounts: the disc shape, the metallic surface, the dome or raised section on the upper part of the disc, the size. She was close enough to see detail, close enough that the departure of the object affected her physically. She has described the sensation of heat and force when the object rose, and the disorientation that followed. The experience of being close to the object when it left has stayed with Argent with a particular intensity. In interviews given decades later, she has described the moment of the object's departure with the kind of precision that suggests a memory that has not faded with time. The sudden rise, the speed, the physical sensation, the ground-level evidence, the flattened grass, the feel of the air that remained briefly after the object was gone. Argent has also spoken at length about the aftermath, the men who came to the school, the instructions to stay quiet, the feeling, which she has described in several interviews, that the experience had been taken away from her in some sense, that the official response had denied her the ability to openly process and discuss something that had happened to her. That feeling of having had an experience suppressed, of having been told your own experience was not available for discussion, is something she has carried for many years. Witness 4. Terry Peck. Terry Peck was a student at Westall High School, and another member of the group who ran into the Grange to see the object at close range. His account, like Argent's, focuses on the ground phase of the incident, on the object as it was close to or on the ground in the paddock, on the departure, and on the physical aftermath. Peck has been particularly detailed in his descriptions of the physical evidence left in the Grange after the object departed. He was among those who observed the flattened circle of grass, the area of depressed and possibly scorched vegetation that marked the location where the object had been. His descriptions of this evidence, given in interviews over the years, are consistent with other accounts of the same physical evidence. He has also been forthcoming about the emotional and psychological impact of the experience, both the incident itself and the aftermath. The instruction to stay silent, which he received both from the school assembly and from interactions with men who came to the school, created a lasting sense of something wrong, of an experience that had been officially denied even as it had been personally lived. That disjunction between what he knew from direct experience and what he was being told by authority is something Peck has discussed with a particular articulateness in his interviews. One detail that Peck has added, which does not appear in all accounts, is the behavior of the conventional aircraft that circled the Grange after the disc departed. He has described watching those aircraft from the schoolyard as they continued their circular pattern over the paddock, and he has described the distinct impression that the people in those aircraft were looking for something, were following something, were tracking something that had just been below them and was now gone. Whether that impression was accurate is impossible to verify, but it is part of his memory of the morning, a memory that has remained intact and detailed across nearly 60 years. Witness 5. Vivian Jenkinson. Vivian Jenkinson was a student at Westall State School, the primary school adjacent to the high school, which means she was younger than the high school students when the incident occurred. She would have been perhaps 11 or 12 in the upper years of primary school, and her account has a quality of directness and simplicity that is somewhat different from the more elaborate retrospective accounts of the older students. What Jenkinson saw from the primary school side of the school boundary was the object in the sky, its descent, and its disappearance behind the trees. She did not go into the Grange. Primary school students were more strictly supervised than high school students, and less likely to have been able to independently run to the boundary of the school grounds and beyond. But her testimony is valuable precisely because it represents the primary school witness population, the younger children who were also watching from a different vantage point on the morning of April 6th. Their accounts, to the extent they've been recorded, are consistent with the high school accounts. The disc shape, the silver-gray color, the deliberate descent, the sense of an object that was clearly not an aircraft. Jenkinson has also spoken about what happened at the primary school in the aftermath, the teachers' responses, the instruction to be quiet, the sense of an event that was being officially discouraged from discussion. The pattern at the primary school mirrored the pattern at the high school, authority figures attempting to manage and minimize an experience that the children had clearly and directly had. Witness 6. Charles Brew. Charles Brew was not a student or a teacher. He was an adult resident of the area who witnessed the object from outside the school grounds, making him part of a small but significant group of non-school witnesses whose accounts corroborate the school-based testimony from a different vantage point. Brew reported seeing the object from his property, which was near enough to the school grounds that he had a clear view of the Grange and the airspace over it. His description of the object was consistent with the school-based accounts in terms of shape and color. He also reported seeing the conventional aircraft that circled the area after the object departed. What makes Brew's testimony particularly interesting is that he reported the sighting to official authorities. He made a formal report to the Royal Australian Air Force. This report, and the RAAF's response to it, is part of the documented official record of the Westall incident, and we will examine that record in detail later in this account. But Brew's decision to report what he had seen, and the official response he received, is an important data point in the broader story of how the incident was handled by the authorities. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a credible and reliable man, not given to fantasy or exaggeration, with no particular interest in UFO culture or belief. He saw something, he reported it, and the response he received, which was essentially a non-response, left him with the same sense of frustrated bewilderment that characterized the experience of most of the Westall witnesses in their encounters with official processes. Witness 7. Barbara and Alan Rowan. Barbara and Alan Rowan are a married couple who both witnessed aspects of the Westall incident, making them jointly one of the witness accounts in the record. They were not at the school, they were residents of the area, and their accounts therefore provide another point of corroboration from outside the school witness population. The Rowans have, over the years, contributed to the record of the incident through interviews with researchers and documentary filmmakers. Their accounts are consistent with the broader pattern of testimony, an object that was clearly disc-shaped, clearly metallic, clearly not a conventional aircraft, behaving in ways that no conventional aircraft of the era could behave. They have also contributed testimony about the physical evidence in the Grange, which they observed before it was cleared. Their descriptions of the flattened circle of grass, the area of apparent ground disturbance in the paddock, match the descriptions given by student witnesses who were closer to the evidence. Their testimony as a couple is notable because it provides a degree of mutual corroboration. They were together when they witnessed aspects of the incident, and they have given separate and independent accounts that agree in their fundamental details. The consistency between their accounts, given that they experienced the event together and could easily have influenced each other's memories over decades of living together, is another element that supports the reliability of the overall witness record. Witness 8. Maureen Morfitt. Maureen Morfitt was a student at Westall High School, and one of the witnesses whose experience of the aftermath of the incident has been particularly well documented. Her account contributes significantly to the understanding of what happened in the hours and days following the sighting, particularly the way in which the official response affected the student witness population. Morfitt has described the assembly with particular clarity. The gathering of students, the principal's demeanor, the instruction to stay silent, the quality of official gravity that surrounded what was, in the ordinary experience of a 1966 Australian school, an entirely extraordinary event. She has used language in her interviews that suggests the impact of that assembly stayed with her for a very long time. Not just the instruction itself, but the implicit message behind it, which was that what they had seen was real enough and significant enough to require official management. She has also described the period of days following the incident, during which the silence directive was, to varying degrees, maintained at the school. Teachers who would not discuss it, conversations among students that were discouraged, a quality of institutional suppression that sat uncomfortably alongside the vivid shared memory of what they had all seen. Morfitt has been one of the more vocal advocates in the decades since the incident for official acknowledgement of what happened at Westall. Her frustration with the persistent official silence is evident in interviews, and she has been a supporter of the various research and documentary efforts that have attempted to bring the Westall story to broader public attention. Witness 9. Sandra Banks. Sandra Banks was a student at Westall High School who was among those in the schoolyard when the object appeared, and who witnessed both the approach of the object and its descent behind the tree line. Her account, like Joy Clark's, focuses on the aerial phase rather than the ground phase of the incident. Banks has been particularly clear in her descriptions of the object's motion. She has described it as moving with a smoothness and a control that was unlike anything she had seen in the sky before. Not the lurching, banking, engine-roaring movement of conventional aircraft. Something different. Something controlled in a way that suggested either a very advanced propulsion system or a fundamentally different relationship with the physics of flight from anything she had a framework for understanding. She has also spoken about the aftermath with particular attention to the long-term psychological impact of the experience. Not a damaging impact in the clinical sense, but a lasting recalibration of her sense of what was possible in the world, of what the range of real things included. You do not see what Sandra Banks and the other Westall witnesses say they saw, and come away from it with your worldview entirely intact. Something changes. Something in your understanding of the universe shifts. And for Banks, as for many of the Westall witnesses, That shift has been a permanent feature of her inner life ever since the morning of April 6th, 1966. Section 10. The School. In the following days, the days that followed April 6th at Westall High School and Westall State School, have a particular texture in the accounts of those who were there. A texture of enforced normalcy, of the ordinary routine of school life being insisted upon as though it could paper over the extraordinary thing that had happened. Of teachers who would not meet their students' eyes when the subject arose. Of conversations that were cut short, questions that were deflected, curiosity that was discouraged. This texture is important. It is not the texture of a place where an ordinary and easily explicable event has occurred and people have simply moved on. It is the texture of a place under a kind of informal interdiction, where the normal social process of processing an unusual event, talking about it, comparing notes, speculating about explanations, has been interrupted and redirected by institutional authority. Some students did continue to talk. Teenagers in 1966 were not so wholly different from teenagers in any other era that they would simply comply in total silence with an instruction not to discuss something as remarkable as what they had witnessed. Conversations happened in the corners of classrooms, on the walk home from school, in the privacy of bedrooms away from adult ears. The instruction to stay silent was imperfectly enforced, as such instructions always are when the population subject to them is large and the event they concern is vivid and recent. But the public, institutional discourse around the incident, in the school, in the broader community, in the local press, was managed more successfully. And the reasons for that management tell us something important about how the incident was viewed by whoever had decided that it needed to be managed. The question that hovers over the post-incident period at Westall is this: who made the decision that the incident needed to be contained? The principal of the school did not, on his own authority, decide to convene an assembly and instruct 200 students to maintain silence about what they had seen. The teachers did not independently decide to change their behavior and refuse to discuss the morning's events. The physical evidence in the Grange did not remove itself. These things required direction from somewhere. They required someone with authority over the school, over the people in it, and over the physical space adjacent to it, to have decided that action was needed. That someone remains unidentified in any public record. No government department has acknowledged instructing the school. No military body has acknowledged sending personnel. The records that might identify the source of the instruction, if they exist, if they were created, if they have not been destroyed or simply never documented, have not been made public. Section 11. The Royal Australian Air Force. The Royal Australian Air Force is the official body most directly relevant to what happened at Westall on April 6, 1966. The RAAF was responsible, in 1966, for monitoring and investigating reports of unusual aerial phenomena in Australian airspace. It maintained records of UFO reports. It had personnel and procedures for responding to credible sightings. What the RAAF did in response to the Westall incident is, in the documented record, very little, and that is itself a significant fact. Charles Brew, as noted above, made a formal report to the RAAF. His report was received. What happened to it? What investigation was conducted? What conclusions were reached? What documentation was produced? Is not part of any public record that researchers have been able to locate. If the RAAF investigated the Westall incident, the results of that investigation have not been released. If the RAAF decided not to investigate, that decision has not been acknowledged. When researchers and journalists have attempted to access RAAF records relating to the Westall incident, they have encountered a consistent pattern. Records that should exist, given the scale of the sighting and the formal report that was made, either do not appear in the available archives or are not accessible. This is not unique to the Westall case. Australian UFO researchers have encountered similar gaps in official records for multiple significant Australian sightings of the era. But the gap is particularly notable in the Westall case, given the number of witnesses and the apparent involvement of official personnel at the school in the aftermath. What the RAAF's involvement at Westall would have looked like, if it had been standard and above board, is fairly clear. A report would have been taken. An investigation officer would have been assigned. Witnesses would have been interviewed. Physical evidence at the site would have been examined. A conclusion would have been reached and documented, even if that conclusion were simply conventional explanation not determined, or insufficient evidence to categorize. This is the standard procedural response to a credible UFO report of the scale of the Westall incident. None of that standard procedural response appears to have occurred, or if it occurred, it did not produce any accessible documentation. The RAAF, when pressed on the matter in subsequent decades, has given responses that amount to a bureaucratic non-acknowledgement of the incident. It is neither confirmed nor denied. It is simply not there in the record. This absence, this institutional blank space where a response should be, is itself a form of testimony. Not testimony to what the object was or where it came from, but testimony to the fact that the standard procedures for handling unusual aerial events were not applied to Westall in April 1966, which tells you that whoever was handling the Westall incident had decided that the standard procedures were not appropriate for this particular case. Section 12. The local press. The local press in Melbourne's southeastern suburbs in April 1966 did cover the Westall incident. It was, after all, a local story of some significance. 200 students at a local school had witnessed an unusual aerial event. A story like that was not the kind of thing that a local paper could simply ignore. The coverage that appeared in the local press was, however, notable for its minimizing tone and its brevity. Stories that described the event in terms that suggested the official perspective, that there was surely an ordinary explanation, and that gave relatively little space to the detailed witness accounts that were available. Witnesses who gave testimony to local journalists found that their accounts were sometimes condensed, sometimes reframed, sometimes quietly shifted in emphasis in ways that changed the impact of what they were describing. One witness who spoke to a journalist in the immediate aftermath of the incident later described being surprised, when she read the story that appeared in the paper, to find that her account had been rendered in a way that made it sound less certain, less direct, and more tentative than what she had actually said. The journalist, whether through carelessness or through some more deliberate editorial choice, had softened the edges of her testimony in ways that made the whole thing seem rather less conclusive than it was. Whether this was the result of journalistic convention, which in 1966 was generally skeptical of UFO reports and inclined to frame them in ways that distanced the publication from any suggestion of credulous acceptance, or whether it reflected some pressure from outside the editorial process, is impossible to determine now. What can be said is that the coverage that appeared was not commensurate with the scale of the event. 200 witnesses, a landed disc, physical evidence, and that the people who gave accounts to journalists were not uniformly satisfied with how those accounts appeared in print. The Westall incident did not receive significant national press coverage in 1966. It did not become, in the immediate aftermath of the event, a nationally discussed story. It remained local, contained within the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, and over time, it faded from the local press as well, replaced by the ordinary succession of local news and community events that fills the pages of suburban newspapers. This is unusual, given the scale of the sighting. A mass UFO sighting, witnessed by more than 200 people, involving a landed craft and the subsequent appearance of conventional aircraft over the site, would, in most media environments, have generated considerably more press coverage than the Westall incident received. The relative quietness of the press response is another data point in the pattern that runs through the entire Westall story, an extraordinary event managed toward insignificance. Section 13. The long silence. For many years, the Westall incident existed primarily in the private memories of those who had witnessed it. Not entirely forgotten, the people who had been there remembered it, and in the communities of working-class Melbourne's southeastern suburbs, it was a story that circulated in the way that local stories circulate, passed between people who had been at the school or who knew people who had been at the school, told and retold in the private contexts of family and friendship. But it was not a public story. It was not part of the documented record of Australian history. It was not taught in schools or acknowledged in official accounts. It existed in a kind of informal underground, a story that the people who knew it knew was true, but which had no public validation, no official acknowledgement, no institutional recognition. This period of silence, from 1966 to the late 1990s and early 2000s, when researchers began to take a more systematic interest in the Westall case, was a period during which the witnesses aged and the vividness of their memories, which had been preserved by the intensity of the original experience and by the unusual nature of the official response, remained intact. Memory is, of course, an imperfect instrument. Over decades, details shift. Accounts that are told repeatedly take on a slightly different character from accounts that are kept entirely private. The act of remembering is also, to some degree, the act of reconstructing, of filling in gaps with inference and expectation and the general patterns of how things usually go. All of this is true of the Westall witnesses, as it is true of all human memory. But the fundamental consistency of the accounts, across witnesses who had not been in regular contact with each other for decades, and across the considerable span of time that separates the event from the most recent major wave of documented testimony, is remarkable. The core elements, the disc shape, the silver-gray color, the descent and landing, the physical evidence, the men who came to the school, the instruction to stay silent, these are present across almost all accounts, given by people who had not compared notes, who had lived their separate lives in the years between the event and their eventual public testimony. That consistency argues against the most common skeptical explanation for mass witness events, which is that accounts become aligned over time through the sharing and comparison of stories, with individual memories gradually conforming to a shared narrative through a process of unconscious social influence. If the Westall witnesses had been meeting regularly over decades to compare and align their accounts, you might expect precisely this kind of consistency. But they had not. They had largely gone their separate ways after leaving school. And yet the accounts aligned anyway, because they were describing the same thing that they had actually seen. Section 14. The 2006 Reunion and Documentary. The first significant public effort to document the Westall incident in a comprehensive way came in 2005 and 2006, when a researcher and filmmaker named Shane Ryan began gathering testimony from surviving witnesses and working to compile a documentary record of the event. Ryan's work was motivated by his own connection to the story. He was not a witness himself, but had grown up in the area and had known about the incident from local community knowledge. His approach to the documentary work was methodical and respectful. He sought out witnesses across the decades-wide scatter of Australian life, found them in their various retirement-age lives, and asked them to tell their stories on camera. The result was a documentary and a reunion event held in 2006 that brought together survivors of the Westall incident for the first time in many years. That reunion and the documentary that emerged from it were the catalysts for the Westall incident's entry into broader public consciousness. They were covered by Australian media in ways that the original event had not been, and they introduced a new generation to a story that had been circulating in local memory for 40 years. The reunion was an event of considerable emotional weight for those who attended. Many of the witnesses had not seen each other since the event itself. Many had spent decades wondering whether their memories were accurate, whether the official silence that surrounded the incident was a form of implicit acknowledgement of its significance, whether they would ever receive any official explanation of what they had seen. The testimony that emerged from the 2006 documentary process enriched the public record of the Westall incident significantly. Ryan gathered accounts from more witnesses than had previously been documented, and the picture that emerged from those accounts was both more detailed and more consistent than the partial record that had previously existed. The documentary itself brought the Westall story to a national audience for the first time. The RAAF's response to renewed interest generated by the documentary was, in keeping with its historical pattern on the subject, essentially a non-response. No new documents were produced, no explanations were offered. The institutional silence that had characterized the official posture on the Westall incident since 1966 remained intact. Section 15. What the documents do and don't tell us. Australia, like many countries, has freedom of information processes that allow citizens to request access to government documents. In the years following the renewed public interest in the Westall incident generated by the 2006 documentary and reunion, researchers made a number of freedom of information requests relating to the incident, seeking documents that might shed light on the official response to what had happened on April 6, 1966. The results of these requests were, in a word, disappointing. Not entirely empty, some documents relating to the general history of Australian UFO investigation were accessible, and these provided context for understanding how Australian military and government bodies approached unusual aerial phenomena in the 1960s. But documents specifically relating to the Westall incident were either not found or found only in fragmentary form, or assessed as still requiring withholding for reasons that were not specified in detail. This absence of documentation is itself a form of information. For an event of the scale of the Westall incident, 200 and more witnesses, a formal complaint to the RAF, apparent official presence at the school in the aftermath, one would expect a documentary trail. Reports, internal memos, investigation records, witness interview summaries. These are the kinds of documents that official processes produce, and they would ordinarily be retained in archives even if access to them were restricted. Their absence from accessible archives raises two possibilities. The first is that the documents exist but have been withheld, classified, or deliberately made inaccessible. The second is that the documents were destroyed or were never created in the first place, which would itself represent a form of deliberate record management. Either possibility points in the same direction, toward a decision, made at some level of the official apparatus, that the Westall incident was not to be part of the accessible public record. What the documents that do exist tell us is partial and indirect. They confirm that the RAAF maintained records of UFO reports during the 1960s, and that the procedures for handling such reports were well established. They confirmed that the period of the Westall incident was a period of heightened official interest in unusual aerial phenomena, partly because of the Cold War context in which the possibility of foreign aerial surveillance was a live concern. They do not confirm any specific investigation of the Westall incident, and they do not provide any official explanation for what was seen there. Section 16. The explanations that have been offered. Over the nearly 60 years since the Westall incident, various explanations have been offered for what the witnesses saw. It is worthwhile examining these explanations carefully, not with the intent of dismissing them, but with the intent of understanding what each explains and what each fails to explain in the face of the available evidence. The most common conventional explanation offered for the Westall incident is that the witnesses saw an experimental aircraft. In the context of 1966, this explanation has a certain plausibility. The mid-1960s were a period of intensive experimental aircraft development in the United States and elsewhere, and some of the experimental aircraft being developed in that era had disc or unconventional shapes that might, at a distance and under certain conditions, be misidentified as something more exotic. However, this explanation faces several significant difficulties when applied to the specific details of the Westall incident. The behavior of the object, its vertical ascent and descent, its hovering, the physical effects associated with its presence and departure, does not match the capabilities of any experimental aircraft of the 1960s whose existence is publicly known. The Australian government and military have not acknowledged conducting experimental aircraft tests in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne in 1966, which would be an extraordinary location for such a test. And the specific physical effects described by witnesses, the heat, the force at departure, the physical evidence on the ground, are not consistent with a simple aircraft flyover. A second conventional explanation is that the witnesses saw a high-altitude balloon, possibly a weather balloon or a research balloon of some kind. Balloons can, under certain conditions, appear disc-shaped and metallic to observers on the ground. But a balloon does not hover, does not ascend and descend with the controlled precision described by the Westall witnesses, does not produce physical effects strong enough to knock people over, and does not leave a circular impression in grass. The balloon explanation, while it can account for some elements of the visual sighting, cannot account for the totality of the experience described by 200 witnesses. A third explanation, offered less frequently but present in some skeptical accounts, is that the entire incident was a case of mass suggestion, in which a small initial misidentification snowballed through the student population into a collectively reinforced and amplified narrative that diverged significantly from any actual event. This explanation is essentially a claim that 200 people were simultaneously deluded in the same way, with no unusual event at the center. It struggles against the presence of adult witnesses who independently describe the same object, the physical evidence in the Grange, the behavior of the conventional aircraft that appeared over the site, and the official response that would be inexplicable if nothing real had happened. What none of the conventional explanations accounts for, taken as a whole, is the official response. Whatever was in the paddock at the Grange on the morning of April 6, 1966, the institutional reaction to it was not the reaction to something ordinary. You do not send men in suits to a school. You do not hold an assembly instructing students to maintain silence. You do not clear physical evidence from a paddock if what happened that morning was simply a weather balloon or an experimental aircraft exercise. The official response is the clearest signal we have that what happened at Westall was taken seriously by people with access to information that the witnesses were not allowed to share. Section 17. The broader context of Australian UFO activity. The Westall incident did not occur in isolation. It took place in a decade and in a country that was, by the documented record, experiencing a significant number of unusual aerial phenomena reports, and in a world that was, in the mid-1960s, engaged in a complex and not always transparent management of those reports. Australia in the 1960s was, relative to its population, a country with a high rate of UFO reports. The wide, sparsely populated interior of the continent, the low level of air traffic compared to more densely populated parts of the world, and the cultural environment of the era all contributed to a context in which unusual aerial events were relatively frequently reported. The RAAF maintained records of these reports, and those records, to the extent they are accessible, paint a picture of a significant number of unexplained sightings during the decade. The specific context of 1966 is also significant. 2 years earlier, in 1964, there had been the Boyanai encounters in Papua New Guinea, in which an Anglican priest and many members of his community had reported seeing craft and humanoid figures in the sky over several nights. In 1964 also, the Westminster UFO wave in Western Australia had produced multiple reports from credible witnesses. The year 1965 had seen the Baldwin photograph, taken in Melbourne, which showed an object that multiple photographic analysts over the years have been unable to explain as a conventional aircraft or natural phenomenon. Westall itself sits within this broader context of Australian UFO activity of the era. It is not an isolated anomaly, but part of a pattern. The pattern suggests that whatever was producing these reports, whether conventional phenomena systematically misidentified by witnesses or something less easily categorized, it was present in Australian skies in the 1960s with a regularity that the official record has been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The connection to Pine Gap, the joint Australian-American intelligence facility in the Northern Territory, is sometimes raised in connection with Australian UFO activity of this era. Pine Gap became operational in 1970, but the preparatory work for its establishment was underway throughout the 1960s, and the surveillance and tracking infrastructure associated with it was being developed during the period of the Westall incident. Whether any connection exists between Pine Gap's precursor activities and the UFO reports of 1960s Australia is a matter of speculation rather than documented fact. But the existence of highly sensitive intelligence activities in Australia during this period is relevant background for understanding the official response to unusual aerial events. Section 18. What became of the Grange? The paddock known as the Grange, where the object descended and landed on the morning of April 6, 1966, no longer exists as it was then. The land has been developed. The area that was open agricultural paddock in 1966 is now, to varying degrees, covered by the urban development that has continued to expand through Melbourne's southeastern suburbs in the decades since. The specific area where the physical evidence was found, the flattened circle of grass, is now, if various accounts can be reconciled with current geography, under or adjacent to what is now a sports ground or recreational area associated with the school complex. The trees that formed the boundary between the school grounds and the Grange are largely gone. The configuration of the landscape has changed significantly enough that establishing the precise location of the landing site requires a degree of careful triangulation from the accounts of witnesses who remember the geography of 1966. This transformation of the physical landscape is not, in itself, suspicious. Melbourne has grown and changed significantly since 1966, and the southeastern suburbs that were at the edge of the developed area in the 1960s are now thoroughly integrated into the continuous urban fabric. Land that was agricultural paddock then is now housing and schools and sports grounds and shopping centers. The Grange's transformation into developed land is part of a broad pattern of suburban growth that has nothing specifically to do with the incident of April 6th. But the loss of the physical landscape is also a loss of a kind of testimony. The place where it happened is no longer there to be examined, to be walked through, to be approached from the angle that the witnesses approached it on that morning. The physical geography that structured the experience of April 6th, the school grounds, the tree line, the open paddock, the particular configuration of space and visibility that shaped what was seen and from where, no longer exists. What remains is memory and the documentary record, both imperfect, both subject to the erosions of time. Section 19. The witnesses and their later lives. The people who witnessed the Westall incident have lived their lives with the weight of an experience that was significant, undeniable, and officially unacknowledged. They have been accountants, teachers, tradespeople, parents and grandparents, residents of Melbourne's suburbs and country towns, ordinary Australians in every external sense. And inside that ordinary exterior, they have carried the knowledge of a morning in 1966, when something landed in a paddock and the world as they understood it briefly and irrevocably changed. Some of them have spoken publicly about the experience, and those who have done so describe with remarkable consistency the psychological and social dimensions of carrying an officially unacknowledged experience. The frustration of knowing something is true and having the institutional world deny it. The exhaustion of decades of being the person who tells a story that most people file under probably a mistake or maybe misremembering. The sense of having had something taken from you, not the experience itself, which no authority can erase from memory, but the right to discuss it openly, to have it acknowledged, to be believed without qualification. Several witnesses have described the Westall incident as among the most defining experiences of their lives. Not because they found it frightening, though some did. Not because it disrupted their ability to function in the world, though the period of official suppression immediately following it was, by most accounts, genuinely distressing. But because it expanded their sense of what was possible. Because it gave them direct, physical, unambiguous evidence that the world contained things that the official frameworks of understanding had not accounted for. That expansion of the possible is both a gift and a burden. It is a gift because it means you live with a wider and more interesting universe. It is a burden because the official world does not, in general, endorse the wider universe, and living in permanent tension between what you know from direct experience and what the official world acknowledges is exhausting. Section 20. The question of what it was. We have spent the better part of this account describing what happened at Westall on April 6, 1966, and in the days that followed. We have not spent much time asking what the object actually was. This restraint has been deliberate. It is easy, in a story like this, to drift from the documented experience of real human beings into speculation that outpaces the available evidence. And speculation that outpaces the evidence is ultimately not more useful than the official silence it is meant to fill. It simply trades one kind of unknowing for another. What we can say with confidence, based on the weight of the documented witness testimony and the context of the official response, is this. Something real was in the Grange on the morning of April 6th. It was not a conventional aircraft. It was not a weather balloon. It was not a misidentification of any ordinary aerial phenomenon that would account for the totality of the evidence. It was physical. It left evidence on the ground. It produced physical effects in the people who came close to it. It was seen and described consistently by more than 200 witnesses. Beyond that, we move into the territory of what we do not know. Whether it was of terrestrial origin, an advanced technology developed by some human agency that has not been publicly acknowledged, or whether it was of non-terrestrial origin, is a question for which we have no definitive answer. Both possibilities remain open. The evidence from Westall does not determine between them. What the evidence does tell us is that the question of what it was is a question that someone, somewhere, in the official apparatus of Australia in 1966, had decided should not be publicly answered. The suppression of the Westall incident, the silencing of witnesses, the clearing of physical evidence, the institutional management of the school, the absence of official documentation, was not the response of a government that did not know what the object was. It was the response of a government, or an element of a government, that did know, or thought it knew, and had decided that knowing was not something to share. Section 21. The geography of silence. One of the things that makes the Westall incident distinctive within the broader history of UFO sightings is the specificity of the silence that surrounded it. This was not the diffuse, ambient silence that attaches to most unusual events, the gradual fading from public discourse that happens when there is nothing to sustain attention. This was a purposeful silence, a silence that was created and maintained through deliberate action by identifiable institutional forces. That specificity is itself informative. Mass UFO sightings have occurred in many countries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Most of them have been met with some degree of skeptical dismissal from official quarters, and most have faded from public attention over time through the ordinary mechanisms of news cycles and cultural memory. Very few have been met with the kind of active, immediate, on-the-ground management that appears to have been applied to the Westall incident. The men in suits who came to the school, the instruction to maintain silence at an official assembly, the clearing of physical evidence from the Grange, the absence of accessible official documentation. These are not the features of a routine dismissal of an unusual aerial report. They are the features of a response that took the incident seriously enough to require management. The question of what that seriousness was based on is one we cannot fully answer, but we can note that a government or military body that takes an unusual aerial event seriously enough to actively suppress witness testimony and clear physical evidence is either a government that knows what the object was, or a government that does not know what it was, but has decided that the implications of not knowing are dangerous enough to require suppression. Either interpretation is significant. Neither points toward nothing to see here. Section 22. What the children knew. There is something particular about the Westall incident that is easy to lose in the analysis of evidence and official responses and the mechanics of suppression. It is this. The primary witnesses were children. Not all of them. There were adult teachers and adult community members among the witness population, but the great majority of the 200 and more people who saw the object that morning were students at two schools, young people between the ages of 10 and 18, who were going about the ordinary business of a Wednesday morning when something came out of the sky and changed their understanding of the world. Those children grew up. They became adults and then older adults, and now they are in their 70s, and some of them are older still. And they've carried the memory of that morning through all the stages of a life. Through the years of growing up and leaving school and beginning adult life in 1960s and 1970s Australia. Through careers and marriages and the raising of their own children. Through the enormous social changes that transformed Australian life in the second half of the 20th century. Through the coming of the internet and the sudden availability of platforms on which a story like theirs could be told to audiences that the local Melbourne press of 1966 could never have reached. They have carried it, and most of them, for most of the years since, have carried it quietly. Not because they were ashamed of what they had seen, not because they doubted their own memories, but because the official world had told them, clearly and early, that what they had seen was not to be spoken of. And the pressure of that institutional judgment, delivered when they were children and therefore particularly susceptible to the authority behind it, had shaped their relationship to the story in ways that persisted long into adulthood. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that. A government, or some arm of a government, told children to be silent about a real experience, told them that their own direct sensory experience was not available for public acknowledgement, told them, in effect, that there was a category of knowledge that they were permitted to hold privately, but forbidden to discuss publicly. That is not a neutral act. It is an act with psychological consequences that played out across decades in the lives of real people. Section 23. The significance of April 6th. April 6th, 1966. A Wednesday. Autumn in Melbourne. The leaves turning on the deciduous trees that had been planted in the suburbs' gardens by the British and European migrants, who preferred the seasonal rhythms of the northern hemisphere to the subtler color changes of the native eucalyptus landscape. The morning cool and pale. School in session. On that morning, something arrived over the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne and descended into a paddock beside two schools. It was seen by more than 200 people. It left physical evidence. And then it departed, rising straight up into the autumn sky and vanishing. The significance of April 6th lies not in the strangeness of the event itself, though the event was strange, but in everything that followed it. In the official response that treated a mass sighting as something requiring suppression rather than explanation. In the silencing of children by institutional authority. In the decades of absence from the public record. in the persistence of memory against the pressure of that absence, in the eventual emergence of the story, partial and incomplete as it remains, into a form where it can be examined and considered by people who were not there. The significance lies also in what April 6th represents about the relationship between ordinary people and the official management of knowledge. The witnesses at Westall had a direct physical experience. They knew what they had seen. No authority could take that knowledge from them, though authorities tried to prevent it from becoming public knowledge. And after nearly 60 years, it is public knowledge, imperfect and contested and still lacking official acknowledgement, but present in the record in a way that cannot now be undone. Section 24. The Continuing Search. Researchers continue to work on the Westall incident. Shane Ryan, whose 2006 documentary work was the catalyst for the most significant wave of public attention, has continued to gather testimony and to push for official acknowledgement. Other researchers, in Australia and internationally, have taken up the case. Journalists have written about it. Documentary filmmakers have returned to it. The internet has allowed witnesses who had no way to connect with each other in 1966 or in the following decades to compare notes, to find confirmation for memories that had existed in isolation, to locate researchers who were willing to listen and document. The continuing search for documentation has produced some results, though not the definitive official acknowledgement that witnesses and researchers have sought. Partial documents, peripheral references, the general shape of the official apparatus for handling unusual aerial events in the 1960s, all of this has accumulated in the public record. But the core of the official response to Westall remains inaccessible. What the men in suits knew, what they had been told, what they reported back to whoever had sent them. The witnesses who are still living are aging. The youngest of the students who were at Westall in April 1966 are now in their early 70s. The window of time in which first-hand testimony can be gathered from living witnesses is closing. Each year, that window narrows. The documentary record that exists, the interviews, the documentary footage, the written accounts, the historical research, becomes more important as the witness population diminishes. This is not a story that will end with a revelation. It will not end with a government document being released that explains everything and acknowledges the reality of what happened at Westall on April 6, 1966. History does not usually work that way. The official acknowledgement that witnesses have sought, that they deserve, that the scale and quality of the evidence supports, may never come in the form of a formal statement by a government agency. But the story exists now in the public record, and it will continue to exist there, carried forward by the documentary work of researchers and the testimony of witnesses, and the gradual accumulation of a historical record that is, if not complete, substantially more than the silence that followed April 6th for so many years. Section 25. What was taken and what remains? Let us end this account by thinking carefully about what was taken from the witnesses at Westall and what remains. What was taken from them was the simple right to have an experience publicly acknowledged. The experience itself could not be taken. Memory is not an institution. It does not respond to official directives in the way that newspapers and schools and military bodies do. The experience persisted, but the ability to exist openly with that experience, to discuss it without fear of ridicule or official displeasure, to have it enter the public record in its full form rather than as a suppressed local rumor, that was taken. Taken quickly, taken deliberately, taken by people with authority over the institutional environments in which the witnesses live their daily lives. What remains is the testimony. Imperfect, decades old, subject to all the usual caveats about human memory and retrospective reconstruction, and the gradual distortions of time. But there, present, recorded, cross-checked against multiple independent accounts, and consistent in its fundamental elements in ways that simple confabulation cannot explain. What also remains is the question. Not the question of whether something was at Westall on April 6, 1966. The weight of the evidence answers that in the affirmative, with as much certainty as we can expect from witness testimony. But the question of what it was, where it came from, and why the official apparatus of Australia in 1966 decided that the answer to those questions was not something the public was permitted to know. That question is still open. It may remain open. It is possible that the documents that would answer it definitively no longer exist, or will not be accessible within the lifetimes of the surviving witnesses, or will reveal an answer that is, in the end, more prosaic than the decades of suppression would suggest. But it is also possible that they are there, somewhere in the deep archives of government, waiting for a freedom of information request that finds the right combination of keywords, or a researcher who knows exactly which department to ask, or a change in political will that decides the cost of continued silence outweighs whatever it was that made the silence necessary in the first place. The witnesses of Westall have waited nearly 60 years. They have kept the story alive through the force of their own memories, through their willingness to tell it again and again to researchers and journalists and documentary filmmakers and anyone who asked with genuine interest and respect. They have asked for very little in return, beyond acknowledgement, beyond the simple, basic recognition that what they saw was real. They deserve that acknowledgement, and the record they have built, through decades of patient testimony against institutional silence, is a record worth knowing. The morning of April 6th, 1966, was cool and pale and ordinary, and then it wasn't. And then a disc shape descended from the sky into a paddock at the edge of two schools in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. And more than 200 people saw it. And the world, in the quiet, private interiors of 200 lives, was never entirely the same. That is the Westall story. It is a true story. The people who lived it know it is true. And now, in the long, unhurried telling that this story deserves, you know it too. Close. There is a suburb in Melbourne, Australia, that has a secret. It has carried this secret for nearly 60 years, through the generations that have grown up in its streets since 1966, through all the ordinary and extraordinary events of Australian life in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. The secret does not belong to the suburb. It belongs to the people who were there on the morning of April 6th, the people who looked up from their schoolyard and saw something descend from the pale autumn sky. It belongs to the teachers who saw it and were told not to discuss it. It belongs to the residents who witnessed it from their properties and filed reports that disappeared into institutional silence. It belongs, most fundamentally, to the children who ran through the trees into the Grange and saw, up close and unmistakably, something that should not have been there. They are old now, those children, but the memory is not old. The memory is exactly as it was, or as close to that as human memory can maintain across 60 years. The shape in the sky, the descent, the paddock, the physical reality of an object that was present, and then, in an instant, gone. The official acknowledgement they have sought has not come. Perhaps it will not come in their lifetimes. But the story has come. The story is here, in the public record, in the documentary work of researchers, in the digital archives that preserve testimony against the erosion of time, in the telling and retelling that is now available to audiences that the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne in 1966 could not have imagined. If you are someone who thinks carefully about the boundaries of what we know and what remains to be discovered, about the relationship between human institutions and the management of difficult truths, about the persistence of memory against the pressure of official silence, then the Westall incident is worth your time. Not because it resolves anything, not because it provides clean answers to the question of what was in that paddock, but because it demonstrates, with unusual clarity and over an unusual span of time, the human capacity to maintain the truth of an experience against every institutional pressure to deny it. The morning was cool and pale. The sky was that particular shade of southern hemisphere autumn that is softer than summer and clearer than winter. The school was in session. The students were at their desks or in the yard or moving between classes in the ordinary way of an ordinary Wednesday. And then, from the northwest, something came. Rest well. The story of Westall will still be here when you wake up. It has been here for nearly 60 years. It will be here for many years more, carried forward in the testimony of those who saw, and in the work of those who listened, and in the long, unhurried record of a morning that began ordinarily and ended as something else entirely. Re-audit complete. Anti-AI slop. Clean. No M-dashes, no slop patterns. Mode. Narration only. No visual cues. No 4-pillar headers. Format. Documentary/listicle hybrid. Niche. Australian history /ASMR sleep content. Supplemental section, the sounds of that morning. There is a dimension of the Westall incident that does not always receive the attention it deserves in the broader telling of the story. Not the visual dimension, the shape of the object, the color of it, the way it moved through the air and came to rest in the paddock, but the auditory dimension, the sounds and the silences of that April morning in 1966. Sound is one of the ways we ground our experiences in physical reality. When we hear something, when a sound reaches our ears and we locate its source and identify it from the library of sounds we have accumulated across a lifetime of listening, we confirm the presence of the object or event that produced it. Sound is evidence. Sound is physical. Sound travels through air by compression and expansion, by the movement of molecules in waves that originate at a vibrating source and propagate outward until they reach an ear and are translated into the experience of hearing. The object at Westall was, according to most witnesses, nearly silent. This is one of its most unusual features, and one of the features that most clearly distinguishes it from any conventional aircraft of the 1960s era. A conventional aircraft of the period made noise, substantial, sometimes deafening noise. The piston engines of light aircraft produced a characteristic throbbing drone. The turbojets of military and civilian jet aircraft produced a roar that could be heard for miles. Even light experimental aircraft produced engine noise that was a defining feature of their presence. The object over Westall produced almost nothing. Some witnesses describe a very faint humming, a sound at the lower threshold of audibility, felt as much in the chest as heard with the ears. Some describe a mild, high-frequency component to this sound, a faint whine or tone. But most accounts converge on the fundamental strangeness of the object's acoustic signature. For something that large, moving through air, it was extraordinarily quiet. This acoustic near silence is significant for several reasons. It tells us something about the propulsion system, or the absence of one in the conventional sense. It is consistent with a technology that does not rely on combustion or on the direct mechanical interaction of rotating parts with air. It is inconsistent with every known aircraft propulsion technology of 1966, and it is one of the details that the witnesses have maintained consistently across decades of telling, not because it is dramatic — silence, by definition, is not dramatic — but because it was one of the things about the experience that felt most deeply wrong, most clearly different from anything in their existing framework of aerial experience. The departure of the object was, by contrast, associated with a brief but intense physical disturbance that some witnesses describe as having a sound component. Not an engine sound, not a roar or a boom, but something that several witnesses have described as a sharp change in air pressure, the kind of sensation you experience in an aircraft when the cabin suddenly repressurizes, but more sudden and more intense. A brief moment of extreme physical discontinuity that disoriented those closest to the object and knocked some of them off their feet. If this description is accurate, it tells us something about the mechanism of the object's departure. A sudden and powerful enough movement of air, or a sudden change in some other physical property of the immediate environment, could produce exactly this effect: a near instantaneous shift in local air pressure that would be experienced as a physical force by people in the immediate vicinity. What could produce such a localized and instantaneous change is beyond current publicly known physics, which is in itself an interesting fact. The sounds of the conventional aircraft that appeared over the Grange after the object's departure were, by contrast, perfectly ordinary. Witnesses describe them in the ordinary language of light aircraft, the sound of piston engines, the characteristic drone of small planes in flight. The contrast between the acoustic strangeness of the object and the acoustic normality of the conventional aircraft that followed it is, in retrospect, one of the clearest demarcation lines between the extraordinary event and the ordinary world that immediately surrounded it. Supplemental section: The Children Who Were Not Believed. In the immediate days following the Westall incident, many of the student witnesses went home and told their parents what they had seen. This was natural. These were children and young teenagers, and when something extraordinary happens to a child, the instinct is to tell the adults in their life, to bring the experience home, to have it received and processed and validated by the people whose judgment and knowledge represents the child's primary connection to adult understanding of the world. The reception that the student witnesses received when they brought the Westall story home to their families was, by many accounts, mixed. Some parents listened with genuine interest and believed their children without reservation. Others were skeptical, not cruelly or dismissively, but in the ordinary way that adults are skeptical of extraordinary claims, even extraordinary claims from their own children. You must have been mistaken. There must be an ordinary explanation. You must have seen a plane or a balloon or something that looked unusual in the light. Some parents, apparently having received their own communications from the school about the incident, actively discouraged further discussion, reinforcing at home the message that had been delivered in the school assembly. The experience of not being believed, or of being believed only with qualifications that effectively denied the substance of what you were describing, is one that the Westall witnesses have mentioned repeatedly in their later accounts. It added a layer of isolation to the already unusual situation of having witnessed something that the official world was refusing to acknowledge. The school had told them to stay silent. Some of their parents had told them there must be an ordinary explanation. The local press had covered the story briefly and without the depth that would have validated the witnesses' experience of its significance. All of the institutional and social frameworks within which a child normally processes and validates their experiences had, in one way or another, failed to give the Westall experience the acknowledgement it warranted. This failure of acknowledgement has a name in psychology. It is related to what researchers call invalidation, the experience of having one's perceptions, feelings, and experiences denied, minimized, or dismissed by others. Invalidation is not neutral. It has effects on the person who experiences it, particularly when it occurs at a young age and in connection with a significant and vivid experience. It can produce a lasting uncertainty about one's own perceptions, a habit of second-guessing what one has seen or felt, a difficulty in trusting the evidence of one's own senses. What is remarkable about the Westall witnesses is the degree to which, despite decades of invalidation by institutional and social frameworks, the core of their certainty has remained intact. They were told they had not seen what they saw. They were told to be quiet about it. They were surrounded by a world that declined to acknowledge the reality of their experience. And yet the experience itself, the direct and vivid and physical reality of what they had witnessed on the morning of April 6th, remained certain in their memories in ways that the pressure of invalidation could not dissolve. This resilience is itself a form of testimony. Memory that survives decades of social pressure to revise it is memory with a particular quality of root, a depth of grounding in actual experience that distinguishes it from the more malleable constructions that are more easily reshaped by social and institutional influence. Supplemental section: The Paddock in Winter. After the events of April 6th and the weeks that followed, the Grange returned to its ordinary function as an agricultural paddock. The grass grew back. The circular impression that had been visible for a brief period was, as we have noted, cleared by persons unknown in the immediate aftermath of the incident. The land continued to be used for grazing in the way that it had been before the morning that changed it. There is something worth pausing on here. The way that a place can return to ordinary appearance after an extraordinary event. How the physical landscape can resume its mundane function as though nothing has happened, while carrying in the memory of those who know its history a quality that distinguishes it permanently from the ordinary land it appears to be. The Grange in winter 1966 would have looked like what it was: a Melbourne suburban paddock, the grass winter brown or green, the soil soft with moisture, the trees at the boundary bare or nearly bare, the sky the gray-white of Melbourne winter. The schools would have been operating normally, children walking along Westall Road in the ordinary way. And in that paddock, in the flattened grass of a circle that had been cleared and was now invisible, the evidence of what had happened in April was gone. But memory is not land. Memory does not grow over and return to ordinary. In the months and years following April 6th, in the private interior landscape of more than 200 people who had been at those schools on that morning, the Grange was not an ordinary paddock. It was the place where it had been, the place where they had stood and seen, or where some of them had run through the trees and come face to face with something that should not have existed, but did. It was, in the geography of their inner lives, a marked place, a place with a different weight than the surrounding geography of the suburb. This is one of the ways that extraordinary experiences work in the lives of ordinary people. They mark places. The physical location of the experience becomes permanently associated with the experience itself, so that returning to that location, or even thinking of it, reactivates something of the original experience. The emotional weight, the sensory vividness, the felt quality of what happened there. The Grange was, and in some sense remains, for those who know its story, a marked place. Even now, Even after the land has been developed and the physical landscape has changed, there is a quality of significance that attaches to that piece of Melbourne geography that does not attach to the surrounding streets and buildings and sporting grounds. This is not mysticism. It is simply the way that memory works in human beings, the way that place becomes inseparable from experience, the way that geography carries the weight of what has happened in it. Supplemental section: the question of craft. The word craft appears frequently in the accounts of the Westall incident. The witnesses use it, or they use words that imply it: object, vehicle, disc, ship. These are not the words we use for natural phenomena. We do not describe clouds or weather systems or atmospheric optics as craft or vehicles or ships. The language the witnesses use for what they saw at Westall is consistently the language of manufactured things, of engineered objects, of things that have been made rather than things that have simply arisen. This linguistic consistency is significant. Language is not neutral. The words we use to describe an experience reflect how we have processed it, what conceptual framework we have applied. When more than 200 witnesses independently use the language of manufactured objects, that convergence tells us something about the convergence of perception and interpretation. They saw a craft, not a phenomenon, not an anomaly, a craft. Something that had been made, that had a definite shape and a definite surface and definite physical properties, that moved through the air in a controlled way, that responded to the presence of the students in a way that a manufactured object responds to its environment, not a cloud that drifts regardless of what is below it, but something that arrived, stayed, and departed in a way that had the quality of intention. The question of what kind of craft and who or what had made it is the question that the official record declines to answer. But the prior question, whether what was at Westall was a craft at all in the sense of a manufactured object rather than a natural phenomenon, has been answered by the witnesses with great consistency. It was a craft. It was made. It had a shape that was the result of design. It had a surface that was the result of fabrication. It moved in ways that reflected a propulsion system, however different from known propulsion systems that system may have been. This is not a small thing. The distinction between a natural phenomenon and a manufactured object is the distinction between something that arose from physical processes and something that was produced by intelligence. The Westall witnesses did not see a natural phenomenon. They saw something that intelligence had made. And in the absence of any conventional explanation that identifies a human intelligence responsible for making it, we are left with the range of possibilities that follow. Supplemental section: the decade of UFOs. The mid-1960s were not an ordinary time for reports of unusual aerial phenomena. Across the industrialized world, and in particular across the English-speaking world, the period from roughly 1964 to 1968 was a period of significant and documented activity in the UFO sighting record. Not all of this activity is equally well supported by evidence. The UFO literature of the era contains a substantial amount of material that does not withstand careful scrutiny. But stripped of the less credible elements, what remains is a body of sighting reports from credible witnesses in multiple countries that share certain characteristic features. The objects described tend to be disc-shaped or ovoid. They tend to be metallic in appearance, silver or gray. They tend to be silent or nearly silent. They tend to exhibit flight characteristics that are inconsistent with the aeronautical technologies of the time: vertical takeoff and landing, instant acceleration, the ability to stop and hover without any of the mechanical preparation that conventional aircraft require for such maneuvers. And they tend to leave, where they interact with the ground, physical evidence of a kind that is consistent with a heavy or energetically active object having been present. The Westall incident fits this pattern closely. Not because the Westall witnesses were influenced by existing UFO narratives, by most accounts they were not, and the resemblance of their descriptions to the broader pattern emerges from independent observation rather than cultural contamination, but because whatever was being seen in the mid-1960s, in Australia and elsewhere, was apparently consistent across sightings. This cross-sighting consistency is one of the more compelling arguments for taking the phenomenon seriously as a category. If the reports from the 1960s were simply misidentifications of ordinary aerial phenomena, or fabrications, or the products of mass cultural suggestion, you would expect them to vary considerably in their details, to reflect the particular cultural and perceptual biases of different communities in different countries. Instead, you find a remarkable degree of consistency across sightings that occurred independently in different countries among witnesses with no knowledge of each other. The Westall incident is not unique in this decade. It is part of a pattern, and patterns require explanations, even if the explanations are not yet available. This account has now been with you for some time. If you've listened to it from the beginning, you have spent several hours in the company of a story from a suburb in Melbourne, from a morning in 1966, from a paddock called the Grange, where something came out of the sky and 200 people watched. There is something appropriate about the length of this telling. The Westall story has been told and retold for 60 years, in fragments and in private, and in the occasional burst of public attention that it has received over time. It deserves, at least once, to be told in full, to be given the space to breathe that its complexity and its weight require, to be told slowly enough that the details have time to settle, to be felt, to be understood not just as a sequence of events, but as an experience that happened to real people in a real place, and that those real people carried with them for the rest of their lives. Sleep content, by its nature, is content that asks you to slow down, to release the acceleration of waking consciousness, the rapid processing and categorizing and responding that the waking mind is constantly engaged in, to let thoughts and words and stories pass through you at a gentler pace. The Westall story lends itself to this mode. It is a story about patience, in a sense, about the patience required to carry a suppressed truth across decades, about the patience required to gather testimony from aging witnesses one account at a time, about the patience required to build a historical record out of fragments in the absence of official documentation. If this story has moved with you into sleep, or toward it, that is fitting. The witnesses of Westall spent many nights over many years with this story present in their consciousness, turning it over, wondering when or whether the world would acknowledge what they knew. Some of them are no longer living. Some of them are, tonight, as old as their memories are long, lying in their beds in the quiet suburbs of Melbourne and its surroundings, carrying a morning that happened before most of the people alive in the world today were born. The morning was cool and pale. Something came from the northwest. It descended into a paddock beside two schools. 200 people watched. That is the story. It is a true story, and it will be here when the morning comes again. The witnesses of Westall have asked, over the nearly 6 decades since April 6, 1966, for one thing consistently and above all others. Not for fame, or for financial compensation, or for the elaborate satisfaction of being proven right in a dramatic public fashion. What they have asked for is simpler and more fundamental than any of those things. They have asked to be believed. To have a real experience acknowledged as real, to have something they saw with their own eyes and carried in their memories for a lifetime, recognized by the institutions of the world they live in as having actually happened. That is the most basic form of respect one human being can extend to another, to receive their account of their experience without denying it. The Westall incident will at some point receive that acknowledgement, perhaps not officially, not in the form of a government statement or a declassified report, but in the accumulation of documentary evidence, in the persistence of testimony, in the growing public knowledge of what happened on that cool autumn morning in Melbourne. The acknowledgement is already present. It is in the telling. It is in the listening. It is in the decision, made by those who have stayed with this account, to give the witnesses of Westall the time and attention their story deserves. That matters. Exactly what is needed. And when morning comes, and the sun rises over the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, and children walk to school as children always have, passing the place where the Grange once was, most of them will not know what happened there. Most of them will walk past without any awareness of the morning in 1966, when something came down from the sky, and the world briefly showed its stranger face to the children standing in the schoolyard. But some will know. And knowing is not nothing. Knowing is always the beginning of everything.